the title of this talk is The Ethical Dimensions of Air Pollution, and I don't generally write about air pollution. Specifically, I'm going to be talking a little bit more broadly about pollution, lots of different kinds of pollution. We've heard about air pollution primarily today, but of course we're familiar with different kinds of pollution. Typically we think, when we're talking about environmental issues, we're thinking about issues like air pollution, water pollution, land pollution, but there's other kinds of pollution. Of course, we aren't familiar somewhat with noise pollution to a certain extent. We sometimes talk about our own bodies being polluted in a way, systemic intoxication, thinking about drug use or drinking or smoking along those lines. And there are different categories, different ways in which the world or the environment might become polluted, so I'm going to talk a little bit about those too. They're not specifically about these categories. We talk sometimes about accidental pollution, sometimes about deliberate pollution, sometimes about planned pollution, or maybe just inevitable pollution that's a consequence of our own day-to-day emissions or our actions. The way I'm going to proceed here is fairly straightforward. I'm going to introduce essentially three views at the beginning of the talk. I'll then defend the third of these views. Actually, we'll only talk about two views in the three views section, so I apologize about that, but I think there are three dominant views about what makes pollution wrong. I'm going to present the first two in the three views section, and the third one I'll present in the second section on trespass. I'm going to try to defend that one because I think that one's more plausible than the other views. And so I've spent a lot of work trying to defend that view, both in talks like this and in a bunch of my published works. I'll then go into, if we have time for this, some discussion of cases of harmless wrongdoing. That will become apparent why I'm talking about that later. I'll talk then briefly at the end about communicative validation, and then eventually I'll conclude. So if you lose track of what I'm doing, hopefully you can kind of call to mind this outline and figure out where I am in the talk. So here are the three views. Again, it's just two views, but I'm playing with numbers here. I'm going to try to present to you three different dominant views on pollution. The first, most prominent one I take to be the harms view. It's self-explanatory, basically suggests that pollution harms people and devalues the environment. So this is a dominant view. Talk about that. I'll talk briefly about the vice view. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. We heard a little bit about it this morning, but the thought there is that pollution sullies one's character in some way or other, either the polluter's character or the polluted's character. And then thirdly, I'll talk about the trespass view. I'll try to present that view plausibly so that it makes sense. And the thought there is essentially that pollution disrespects or trespasses on others. So let's just start now with this idea. The thought is, well, pollution is wrong. We pretty much understand that, and most of us think about it that way, and that's the way it's been presented so far here, more or less as an assumption. Pollution is wrong. We should probably do what we can to stop it, but not a lot of interrogation generally about what makes pollution wrong. Legally speaking, we find often definitions like this. Pollution is something like the wrongful contamination of the atmosphere, water, or soil to the material injury of the right of an individual. So here's the first view, right, that I told you I was going to present. The thought is basically pollution is wrong because it's harmful to other people, to animals, or to nature more generally. And we see this very frequently in the pesticide discourse. Pesticides destroy ecosystems and insects. Toxins cause harm to humans and animals. Carbon emissions, we have also endorsed essentially this view so far in the discussion about climate change. Carbon emissions cause problems for the climate. They cause harm to the climate, either to the planet and planetary systems, or in some cases to the economy. That's a point of contention within the climate discourse. Noise pollution creates agitation and anger, cutting into work and sleep. You know, that person chewing their cereal in the morning, that's a kind of noise pollution, and so on. So here's typically how this is presented to us. Here's case one. By the way, I'm going to present to you a lot of cases through this talk. It's a peculiarity of philosophy sometimes that people will present cases with the objective of trying to tweak an intuition that you might have about pollution. So I'm going to present a bunch of cases to you through the course here. So here's case one, pollutant, pretty straightforward. Jones, doesn't have to be Jones, but it's just this guy Jones. Jones dumps a pollutant into a river, right? So what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this is that he's done some harm to the river, or harm to the people who live on the river, harm to people who survive make their living on the river. It's easy to think this way in terms of harms, right? Makes people sick, or nature gets damaged or sullied in some way. It's easy to think this way, that harms are the problem here. And there are solutions that emerge from thinking about pollution in terms of harms, right? So sort of the traditional solution is to just spread it more widely, spread our pollution more widely. You've heard the phrase, I hope, that the solution to pollution is dilution. That was a common view when I went to college. I went to college in Michigan, and there was an Upjohn factory there that had a bunch of, they're producing pharmaceuticals, and we went on a tour one day of the Upjohn factory, and there was a concern from the locals that the factory would produce toxins that would create harms for the health of the people in Kalamazoo. And so as a solution to this, Upjohn decided to add a couple feet to the smokestack. Because the thought was that if you just put it a little higher in the atmosphere, it'll spread more widely, and then the harms won't be the population won't be as impacted. So that's a common response. It wasn't the common view throughout the 20th century. Other thoughts are basically if there's a harm caused, then you could just impose a penalty. You might to prevent the harm from being caused. You might also install a Pugovian tax. This is again to sort of shift the demand schedule in some way, or to shift the supply schedule in the other way, to then bring about some kind of social optimum. You could regulate. That's a common way of trying to address harm-causing effects of pollution. You could create a cap-and-trade market. This is maybe a way of harnessing some kind of market mechanism to achieve some efficient outcome. Or you take a Coasean solution. This is Ronald Coase, is an economist, basically proposed that we should just assign and enforce property rights. And if we do that, then interested parties will be more inclined to litigate when it turns out to be the case that they're disadvantaged by somebody else's claims against them. So one very common view that a lot of us probably share is that if it's the case that you're a polluter and you're responsible for having caused some kind of harm, then you should pay, in principle, to clean up the pollution. That sort of makes sense to a lot of us, I think. I think it's an implication of the harms view, and it's not one that I disagree with, or at least an implication of the sort of the pared down harms view. So let's think a little bit more about what the polluter pays principle implies, and we'll talk about case 2 here because I think it problematizes or makes problematic the harms view. Remediation here. Suppose Smith, this is not Jones now, it's Smith, different guy. Smith dumps a pollutant into a river and subsequently introduces a technology to remediate the pollutant such that the effects are undetectable. Right? So we heard earlier this afternoon or this morning from an engineer here thought that the solution to pollution was to introduce technologies that would remediate or take the pollutant out of the environment. The thought then, if you subscribe to the harms view, is that once you remediate the pollutant, you remove the harm-causing agent, then you will return the world to its original state. That seems good, right? But also that there's no wrong done. That's an important implication of subscribing to the harms view. If it's true that you're a polluter and then you clean up your harm, then there will be no wrong done, right? You can't be held responsible, guilty, or liable for any kind of wrongdoing. I think it's a very appealing view, but I have a problem with it. I'm going to get to that in a second. There's a second view. It was dominant for quite a long time. It's less prevalent now, but we did also hear earlier in a panel, I think the second panel today, we heard a view that may be better characterized as a kind of a vice view, right? So this is the thought, not that what's wrong with pollution is that it does some kind of harm or damage to us or to the environment in some way, but rather that it mars us, right? It sullies our character, sullies our soul, right? In such a way that if we were to be evaluated in retrospect by a tribunal of dispassionate judges, let's say, we might be viewed as not good people, right? People of not upstanding moral character, right? It's a kind of an ancient view. You find it all throughout the ancient classical works, but apparently we also find it in the LDS community as well. And I only learned that today from George Hanley, if he's still around. I find that pretty interesting. We see this in some of our environmental communication here, this idea of the sort of the crying Indian. This is a famous environmental communication strategy. The claim here is it's a crying shame to pollute. Of course, one implication of this view is that you might be able to pay for your indulgences by offsetting your bad actions, right? In a way, clean up your character. We see this very frequently in cases of greenwashing, right? For instance, the thought for many companies is that they can pollute on one side of the town, say, but clean up their actions on another side of the town, or at least give the impression that they're cleaning up their character by putting their products in the right kind of fonts, or putting them in the right kinds of stores and selling to the right kinds of people and so on. In the criticism of greenwashing, we also find very often the invocation of vice and virtue language. Here is a campaign that was prevalent not so long ago, extolling or detailing the 7 sins of greenwashing, right? So I'm not going to go through all of these, but basically the thought is that you're essentially sinning by greenwashing, that you're not a person of upstanding moral character. So the vice language is prevalent even to this day. I will note as an aside that I only sort of stumbled upon the vice view quite a long time ago. I was living in Russia about 25 years ago, and the language of pollution as a kind of a vice is not so prevalent in English. But when I was living in Russia, I had just sort of come down to Moscow to visit a friend of mine, Anatoly Voronov, and his daughter. He was an older man. He actually was one of the founders of Glassnet, which eventually became Russia Online. He was there with his daughter, Polina, who at the time was 16 years old. I was 21, 22 years old at the time. I'd come down from Petersburg, which is a beautiful European city, to Moscow. And of course, entering by train, and entering the city by train, you see factories on the outskirts of town, and their smokestacks, and this pollution. And so Anatoly asked me at one point, he said, what do you think about Moscow? And I felt like I should be honest. I said, well, there's a lot of pollution on the outside of town. And so I said, yes, много полуция. Of course, my Russian was kind of pidgin Russian at that point, and I didn't really know what was going on. Anatoly's jaw dropped, and his daughter sort of looked at me like I had electric eels coming out of my eye sockets. It turns out that polluция, didn't we speak Russian in the room? Do you? So evidently in Russian this means it's a male nocturnal emission. I had no idea that I had said this or whatever. It took me a little while to figure out what this meant. I didn't discover until I got home later that I had made this faux pas. But this is prevalent. This is prevalent in many other languages, not English. This use of pollution, the term is polluция in Russian, right? So I thought it was just a straight analog, pollution and polluция, but it is not. It turns out also, I looked at the OED later, in the 1300s, up until about 1850, we were using pollution in the same way, specifically to refer to emissions, human emissions outside of sexual intercourse. So that's a bit of trivia that may be of intrigue to some. And we don't use it that way anymore. Anyway, another fact about the vice view is that it's appropriable. You can appropriate it for purposes of, you can frame it in terms of harms as well. So here's the way in which that crying Indian communications strategy has been subverted in a way to refer to damages and harm instead of to vice. So let me talk now about the third view, the trespass view. And this view, I think, is a little bit more plausible, albeit problematic in its own way, so maybe I can get to that as we move forward here. But I like this view a lot, so I want to try to persuade you of it as well. So let's, just for the sake of playing imagination, pretend that we're having tea, you and me, or you and all of us, me and all of you. We're having tea together. Suppose that I develop a poison, right? Because I'm that kind of a person. I develop a poison that has the potential to kill you, but for which I have the antidote, right? And once the antidote is administered, there will be no ill effects. Suppose that I have this poison. Sorry. Suppose that I put a poison into your tea, right? Suppose I just put it in your tea, and then I sort of chuckle to myself. You might think, that's a horrible thing to do, and I would agree with you that it's a horrible thing to do. I should not put poison into your tea. That's not good of me, right? And you might think that what makes that wrong is that I have harmed you in some way. But if you add to this kind of April Fool's dimension, right, which is that I have an antidote to this poison. Suppose now we're having tea, and I put some poison in your tea, and I poison you, and so maybe you go to the bathroom, and you come back, and I say, I put poison in your tea, and you're going to die, right? And then I say, but I have an antidote, right? And I can give you this antidote, and you will not die if I put this poison in your tea. You might still feel, and I think you would rightly feel, that you have been wronged by my addition of this poison to your tea, right? Even though you have an antidote that can reverse the effects of the poison in your tea. I don't know if anybody feels differently about this. Does anybody feel that you would not have been wronged in some way? Or do you feel that you have been wronged? You would feel that you've been wronged. Yes. Now, what is your inclination, if I may ask, about that wrong?
Something may happen that you're not able to administer the antidote.
Okay, right. So that's right. So that's the next possible response. You might think, well, maybe what's wrong is that I'm putting you at risk in some way, right? So there's a risk that maybe I would have a heart attack, while I'm holding this antidote and don't have the opportunity to administer the antidote to you, or maybe it's the case that the antidote, vial will break on the floor or something along those lines. So there's a risk that I could harm you in a way. But I think that the same kind of logic applies even if I add some kind of inert additive to your tea, right? So suppose that instead of adding poison to your tea, having you come back from the bathroom, chuckling to myself about my April Fool's joke, and then giving you the antidote, I mix the two together, the poison and the antidote, and then I put that in your tea, right? So it's inert at that point. I think, and I don't know if you think, I think there's something wrong with me doing that. Does anybody feel that there is something wrong with me doing that? You do feel that. Okay. The question is, what makes it wrong for me to do that to you, right? If you don't feel that, there's something wrong with this, you might think, it's not any different for me to add an inert additive to your tea than it is for me to add something like water to your tea. There can't be anything clearly wrong with me adding water to your tea. That's what we do, particularly if we're making tea for somebody. We add water to tea, and we're using more or less our judgment about water to tea. And we all more or less understand the effects of water on tea. But I'm sort of the mind that I am not permitted to add water to your tea if you go to the bathroom, and I don't have your permission to add water to your tea. So even though water is a kind of an inert additive. If you're a little bit skeptical about that, I want to add one more wrinkle to this. And so here's another thought. Suppose I don't have a poison in my bag, but I have rather instead a health potion. This is going to be something that's going to make you much healthier than you already are. Something that will cure some of your ailments, or maybe even just make you stronger than you otherwise might be, right? So I've discovered an additive that will add years to your life, let's say, and we're having tea, and I can just add this to your tea while you run off to the bathroom. Now, it seems to me that adding that additive to your tea while you're in the bathroom is a kind of a trespass, a kind of a violation of your space, right? In virtue of the fact that you have to participate in my addition of that additive to your tea. I can't just go adding years to your life against your will, right, without having you participate in that process, right? So it's much like an intruder case, right? I enter your house without your permission. This is a classic case of trespass, by the way. Suppose I enter your house without your permission. I take your dishes out of the cabinet. I use them and then wash them, replace them just as they were. I'm a good guest, right, after all, but you're not home and you don't know that I'm there. I sleep in your bed. I use your sheets, and then I wash and replace them, right? It seems to me that this is a case of what's sometimes called in the philosophy literature harmless wrongdoing, right? I think pollution actually functions along the same kind of logic as harmless wrongdoing cases, trespass cases, right? There's something else going on in pollution cases than in cases of strict harm causing, right? So it's not like me punching you in the face, right? It's more like trespass. And if this is an appropriate analogy, pollution is wrong because it's disrespectful of the person, of other people. So that's kind of what I want to say, right? And then our question is, what makes it disrespectful? What makes it wrong? So that's part 3. It's like, it's all unfolding here, logically, more or less. Okay, so harmless wrongdoing. We're good on this? Does anybody feel like they want to object? Because if you object, you got to go to the microphone. We got to talk. Okay, so harmless wrongdoing. Where's the wrong, right? This is not an easy question to answer. I'm going to go through a bunch of different cases here. They're a little bit silly, a little bit provocative in some cases, but they're classic cases of harmless wrongdoing taken from the philosophy literature, right? So could be in a variety of different locations. Could be in victims' preferences. Could be in one's lack of caring for another. It could be in one's good intentions. Could be in the intentional, accidental nature of the action, the polluting action. Or it could be sort of located in something like the victim's defeasible rights. I'll explain those in a second. But here's the thought. Maybe it's the case, right, that what's wrong with me trespassing on you, right, as a polluter, let's say, is that maybe the victim doesn't want to be trespassed upon, right, would prefer not to ingest or inhale some kind of pollutant of some sort, right? So here's a case, Peeping Tina, right? An older woman, this is a little bit, I apologize about this, but it's a classic case, the Peeping Tom case. I've just reversed the genders a touch. So an older woman, Tina, discovers that a young male neighbor, Joe, showers and changes his clothing at 9:30 every night. Tina finds this exciting and makes it a practice to sneak behind Joe's house and peer in his window to watch. Okay, so something's wrong with Tina, but whatever. This continues nightly for years. Tina tells no one. Joe is none the wiser. Eventually, Tina passes away, taking her secret fascination with her to the grave. So you see, this is a case of harmless wrongdoing, right? So Tina thinks nothing's going to come of. Joe's not harmed by this, right? It seems as though many of us would want to hold on to the idea, or at least I would want to hold on to the idea, that Tina's doing something wrong by engaging in this behavior. And you might think that what makes Tina's action wrong is that she's going against what Joe would want, right? But we can, of course, modify these cases. Philosophers do this all the time. We make up stuff. We can modify it in such a way that Joe's intentions do align with what Tina's doing, right? So imagine Joe is just this kind of guy who likes to show off, right? He's a bodybuilder, right? Maybe he's even a male stripper, something along those lines. And, he'd strip for her or for anybody else, right? And Tina knows this about him because she knows him. She just doesn't really want to be so open about her predilections, let's say. Maybe even Tina wants to sort of offset her indiscretions by leaving a lot of money to Joe later in the future. Well, it seems to me, just like some of our other cases, this is a kind of wrong, despite the fact that she may have offset her actions by leaving him a lot of money. I think that's true. I just want to also mention, I didn't mention this before, one of the techniques that I've deployed in many of my writings is to employ these kind of reversal cases. I think reversal cases really introduce something interesting to our thinking about particularly harmless wrongs. And the book that was mentioned earlier is an attempt to try to, I don't use reversal cases so much in that, but I try to turn our attention away from thinking about environmental problems or environmental wrongs from the standpoint of the promotion of the good or the prevention of the bad. So that's a lot of what that book is about. Anyway, so that's one technique there. But anyway, so I don't think you're going to be able to find the wrong of harmless wrongdoing in isolating or divining a victim's preferences very clearly, because sometimes victims maybe don't want to be victimized, but they don't mind being, say, encroached upon in some way. That's not to say that about all victims, of course, right? That's not what makes them a victim, is the point. Anyway, maybe it's something about lack of clarity. And here's another case, again, a little bit on the unusual side, and I apologize about that. A lack of clarity. Maybe it's the case that the polluter acts fecklessly without concern for those around him or her. So here's hidden camera, and this is another, again, as I said, perversion. Paul is married to Cheryl, right? Paul finds that he gets extra pleasure by hiding a camera in the bedroom. He videotapes numerous intimate moments and stores them for his perusal and privacy. Again, he's not going to do any harm here. He doesn't want to do any harm to Cheryl, right? He shares these tapes with no one, not even Cheryl. Cheryl dies. He continues to enjoy the videos until he eventually dies as well. Well, you might think, well, what's wrong with this is Paul doesn't care about Cheryl, right? But the fact is, as we can modify this again, that's the reason that he's doing this is that he actually loves her very much. You could argue maybe he doesn't love her in the right kind of way. Maybe he has a wrong dispositional orientation towards her. That's possible, right? And we can get into that too if you'd like. But the point here is that it is entirely plausible that he might do this out of love because he is so enwrapped in some way, right? And it's not clear that simply because he doesn't, that he takes these actions, that he somehow doesn't care about his victim. So I don't think it's clear, right, that we can say that what's wrong with Paul's action is that he doesn't care. Or what's wrong with in cases of harmless wrongdoing is that there's a lack of caring on the part of the actor. Another thought might be, well, maybe it's something about good intentions. Maybe it's the case that the polluter has less than admirable intentions in choosing to pollute, right? In other words, only aims to make a buck. So here's another case. This is less weird. Dying promise, right? Classic cases of harmless wrongdoing. Janet is on her deathbed. Her cousin Larry, who is indebted to a loan shark, knows that he'll inherit a large sum of money if he promises to provide for Janet in her passing, right? Janet's children in her passing. He has no intention of doing so, but makes this promise nevertheless. right? So Janet passes away, none the wiser. She leaves her money to Larry. Basic thought here is it would be wrong for Larry to make this promise if he had no intention of fulfilling it. But again, we can modify the case in such a way that he does have the right kinds of intentions, he just executes them poorly, right? Larry promises Janet that he'll use the money to care for her children, to distribute it evenly among them when they get older. He intends to do so, but instead is taken down with gambling. Down to his last dollar, he buys a lottery ticket, luck smiles, he wins back all of the money, blah, 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 and then some, and he distributes a portion of this winnings to Janet's children. There is a sense in which his intentions aren't, strictly speaking, what make problematic the lying promise or in this case, the case of harmless wrongdoing. Maybe it's something about intentional versus accidental scenarios, right? Maybe the polluter isn't aware of the pollution or pollutes by accident, as with chemical spills. And so the awareness is what's going to create a problem. So you imagine another scenario here, very classic case, sandlot. Some children are playing baseball on a sandlot in their neighborhood. By the way, it's opening day for the Rockies today, so that's good news for those who like baseball. If you're a Rockies fan, I don't know if there are any Rockies fans in the room. No? I don't know what's the team out in Utah. It's the Rockies, right?
No, definitely not.
No? The Diamondbacks. Okay. We'll talk later. Now I'm going to start moving around away from the microphone. So, all right, anyway, so sandlot, you mentioned. So being resourceful and responsible. So kids break Frank's light, I believe, the lamppost. Being resourceful and responsible, the kids decide that they'll immediately clean it up. They quickly clean up the glass, run to the hardware store, purchase and install an identical lamp, restoring the house to the state in which Frank had left it, right? Frank returns to his house and is none the wiser. You might think in this case, well, they've undone the wrong and they haven't done anything wrong, but right? But the thought here is like they actually could have done things differently than they did, right? There's another baseball diamond and playground at the end of the street. This particular sandlot is sandwiched between many houses, and Frank has asked the kids for weeks not to play ball near the houses, so they can still wrong him despite the fact that they may have accidentally done some broken his lamppost. So it doesn't seem like it's going to turn on this question of intentional or accidental. And finally, might look at something like the victim's rights, right? Maybe the victim's rights are violated by the Polluting Act. So here's just a case first introduced by Joel Feinberg, former professor at the University of Arizona, now deceased. Lou is hiking the back country. A blizzard sets in. He needs a place to take shelter and stumbles upon a log cabin. Clearly, the cabin belongs to somebody, but he must break in or die. Right? For warmth, he burns the tables and furniture, finding no other firewood around. Upon returning home, he compensates the owner, Gretchen, for her losses. So here's a case where it seems like he may not be doing any wrong if you subscribe to the harms view. But nevertheless, we can introduce additional features of this case that complicate it and make it the case that even though it remains a circumstance of harmless wrongdoing, there is still a wrong done, right? So here's the complication. Before setting out on his hike, Lou decides not to pack necessities, neglecting to bring his sleeping bag, a tent, some food, and winter gear, thinking to himself, you know, if it snows, I can just break into somebody's house, and then I'll pay him back later, right? That seems like there's a kind of a wrong here. So what the point of this is that we can imagine cases where a polluter pollutes by accident, intends to create a better world, cares much for the welfare of their victims, has aims that are congruent with the private preferences of the victim, and even permissibly violates the rights of victims, perhaps remediating for those reasons, but is still wrong, right? That's the point of that longish string of cases there. Essentially leading us to this set of conclusions here, that we need some kind of communicative validation or intersubjective justification to rectify wrongs caused by pollution. The claim here, the solution is that harmless wrongs can be rectified only through communicative validation, through the reconciliation with the wronged, right? That's a post facto after the act, right? Perpetrators must seek to ensure that the reasons guiding their actions are justified in some way. And by justified here, I mean that those actions are both acceptable theoretically, right, and are accepted, practically by all affected. This is important, right? If you understand, and the reason why I want to defend the pollution as trespass view, right? The idea is, I think I say this later in the slides. I hope I do. The reason is that we need to set up democratic institutions that enable us to communicate more clearly with one another about what kind of world we want to live in. If we don't set up those kinds of democratic institutions, then we're not going to be able to rectify or resolve problems that are engendered by pollution. So the claim, again, is that appeals must be made to reasons that a speaker and a hearer can share. We can make these kinds of appeals in all sorts of different forms. If you just think about the Sandlot case, lots of ways those kids might reconcile with Frank, right? We didn't mean any ill. They could say it was an accident. They'd explain themselves. There were bullies at the other diamond that would help Frank understand why they were not they were playing outside of his house. It's important to have these kinds of communicative relationships with one another to address issues associated with pollution, but also many kinds of environmental wrongs. An important part of this as well is that the interlocutor has to be in a position to accept or reject claims, right? And he can do so either on grounds of truthfulness or truth or rightness, right? And all participants to this kind of an arrangement must be engaged in some way or another. We can make speech act appeals, as with any of these cases that I mentioned here. There's the 5 cases. This is the way in which we're going to be able to reconcile problems. So here's the conclusion. Oh, first, that's my book. That's the cover of my book. I don't have a reason to throw it in there. I just wanted to throw that in there because I feel like my editor would want me to do that. So that's the book, and I'm happy to talk about that later too. Anyway, so here's the conclusion. So real quick, just to remind you what I did. I talked about 3 views, but only 2 really. And the third one I talked about in part 2 of this talk was on trespass. I then talked about harmless wrongdoing, and I went through that little set of cases, a little bit long, I suppose, and briefly introduced the idea of communicative validation. Now I'm going to talk about the conclusion. The solution, again, to pollution. The solution is that basically before undertaking to act, before preparing to act, we have to ask ourselves, right? This is our charge as individual actors, whether our reasons would be acceptable by all affected parties, right? And where possible, we should seek that acceptance. So if I'm intending to pollute or emit in some way, I have to ask myself, is this permissible? Is somebody going to allow for this? What I also have to do is create the space for them to do that without some kind of obstruction. That's important for me to support democratic institutions that make that possible. After taking an action, if it's the case that I'm a polluter and I've made I've emitted something or caused some pollution of some sort, then we can only seek reconciliation through some kind of reasoned appeal to the affected parties, right? We just can't take it back, and we can't just undo the wrong by returning nature to its so-called original state, or returning a person to their original state, or putting money in their bank account. That's not enough. We have to do more. So the solution to pollution, as I said, since our only apparent method of redressing wrongs is through reconciliation with the wronged, which is virtually impossible, we need to ensure that our actions as individuals and collectives can pass the test of justification, which is I'm alluding to here, such that those actions could be reconciled with the wronged. The solution to pollution is not dilution. That's what I want to say. Harmless wrongs can only be rectified through communicative validation, and we need to establish, as I've said, democratic institutions that empower affected and polluting parties to act unfettered on their own behalf. The implications, real quick, are that we ought not to pollute since it disrespects people, so I agree. Pollution is a wrong. We ought to seek to clean up our pollution through remediation programs on restitution grounds, and we can be held accountable for doing wrong even if we prevent harm from coming to others by employing remediation technologies. That's it. That's the talk. We'll take questions over at the microphone. Yeah. There's a lot of pressure when you're in line at the microphone. I have to say, yeah. It's much easier to sit in the comfort of... You can walk away. That's right.
No judgment here.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for just presenting this in a different way to think about pollution.
Yeah.
I am curious, why did you put it under the sort of paradigm of harmless?
Harmless wrongdoing?
Yes, instead of harmful wrongdoing, because with the thousands of studies that show how harmful air pollution is to our health, that it doesn't seem like harmless is the right category for that to be considered under.
That's a great question. So the reason it's fundamentally conceptual, right? So I absolutely agree that in most cases, pollution, or what we refer to as pollution or a pollutant is going to have some kind of harmful dimension. But I think that we, in our discourse on pollution, we often focus so strongly on the harms that it would appear, right, by virtue of that language or by virtue of that thinking, that the solution to that pollution problem is to repair the harms or repair the damages. And I don't think that we should just let companies off the hook or let polluters off the hook just by repairing the damages or forking some money over, right? So there are a lot of polluting companies with very deep pockets, and they will sometimes just pay, right, to indulge themselves of our atmospheric shares, of their atmospheric shares. And so what I was trying to do, and I apologize if I didn't make this clear in the talk, is by introducing those reversal cases, right, suggest that there's an additional bit of wrong done, right? And that additional bit of wrong done is visible once we take away the harm. Right, so I don't think, right, in most cases of pollution, that there is not harm done also, right? But I also think we can be polluters and not clearly be causing harm, and that's a very important part of pollution, is that it trespasses on us, on our lives, on our world, and it often gets overlooked. That's all. But I appreciate the comment and the question. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, this is easy. The next in line. Yeah.
So I'm pretty sympathetic with your view, and I have two cases that I want to bring up to see how you respond to them.
Oh, great.
And so if somebody else is in line, I could do one case.
Nobody's in
switch
line.
Places, but don't want to monopolize the microphone.
Yeah.
But so the first case I think is the more straightforward one. So I'm thinking about the condition. So I'm thinking about putting fluoride in municipal water supplies, where the community in question isn't necessarily, at least as a community, maybe some people in the community like it, but not everybody does. And so would that qualify as pollution, and then also qualify as, I guess, immoral or something on your view?
That is a great question. That's a great question. It depends, right? So I happen to, my father was a dentist, and so I'm a fan of fluoride, as it happens, but I'm also a fan of Dr. Strangelove. So I get the tension. I think. Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I think one feature of fluoridation, mass fluoridation of water, is that largely it's done by government institutions that are mostly subjected to some kind of scrutiny from the community, right? And sometimes we see fluoridation programs overturned by communities, right, for a variety of reasons, some of which are terrible. Right? And some of which are maybe plausible. Maybe ozonation works better for dealing with waterborne pathogens. But ultimately, it's that the question of whether it counts as a kind of a trespass is going to hang on whether the decision was subjected to the scrutiny of those who are affected by the fluoridation process. I happen to think there are lots of good reasons to fluoridate water, to deal with waterborne pathogens. But I understand when people object to it. I think I should just add to this that I think you also find, like in our political discourse, a lot of strife, in part because we don't understand this trespass dimension of environmental wrongdoing, right? And people object very often to having government regulators impose a position on them, or people object, let's say, to fracking companies. This happens very much on the Front Range. I'm sure it's happening out here too. It's very frequently the case that there will be a lot of objection to the introduction of a fracking well in a neighborhood, right? And very frequently we find that the objection comes in the form of like the risks to the local population, the environmental costs, the potential for earthquakes sometimes, right, or sometimes even like explosive nature of the fracking wells. We saw about 4 years ago, John Hickenlooper, the former governor of Colorado. I think he stood on a podium not too much like this one, though he's quite a bit taller than I am. He drank a glass of fracking fluid, right? And he said, "Look, it's perfectly safe," right? But a lot of the objection that we find from the community isn't that. Though it comes in the form of, it was phrased as a kind of like objection to the dangers of fracking fluid, I think frequently it's about trespass. It's about violation of a personal space and an insistence that we should have some control over our lives and not be imposed upon by companies, right, who are in the pursuit of profit. So I don't know if that was not directly, that latter bit was not directly related to your fluoride question. Yeah, okay, yeah. Go ahead, your second case.
So the second case, I don't know if I'll be able to formulate this as well as I did the first one, so work with me. But I'm thinking about the case of like dumpster diving, right? Where normally when you consider like throwing away trash or something, oh, it's just straightforward pollution. But if it's something that like, oh, I can count on a pizza being in this trash, right? And like it would be in my best interest, and all of the it's good for me if it happens here, right? How does that work in your framework? I couldn't quite categorize it. And also, what is pollution, right? Because that's not pollution for me if I'm finding a pizza in the trash exactly.
Yeah, well, I take it that, so first of all, if we do designate an area as trash bin, let's say, then that's got a kind of a discrete boundary, presumably, into which we could put our emissions.
Or
and
even
that
like,
wouldn't count as a kind of
like
pollution.
white boxes on the sidewalk or something like that. Because that would apply with the dumpster. It is not a discrete area. So we could use that case if we wanted to. But
I'm not even, that's a really, I don't know. That's a strange case. I mean, suppose it were the case that I were just like throwing remnant bagels out my window as I'm driving down the road. Is that kind of the idea that you have in mind? So I'm just like, whatever. Instead of emitting carbon, I'm throwing bagels out my window, right? And then there's all these folks who are like, wow, look at this, it's raining bagels, right? So you could be benefiting people in the community, I suppose, right? And all the students are scrambling after the bagels, right? But then a couple of grumpy snobs from Park City, they don't like their bagel. the bagel line, a stream coming off the highways or whatever. So I mean, I think they probably they'd be right to have some kind of grievance there that they ought to have some say in how bagels are distributed. And it seems to me we have to make some space. We have to, alternatively, students might also prefer to get bagels maybe a different way, right? There could be channels set up that are a little bit more amenable to all members of the population. I don't know. That's a very bizarre case, and I apologize for taking it in a weird direction. But I do like the idea of somebody throwing bagels off the side of a car. Yeah. That sounds like it's my dream come true. I don't know. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
So I actually thought it was really interesting when you were talking about kind of the green painting that companies often do.
Yeah.
I guess like something that I kind of struggle with is like you see these kinds of movements with kids, especially like I feel like people of my age, doing things like I don't know if you've seen this design type of thing that they have like different strips of color ranging from like blue to red, and what it's supposed to signify is like every single year they it's like the temperature of the climate relative to each other. And I guess like I'm just confused by this juxtaposition of like this kind of green painting that people do while maybe it's not as effective, or I mean, I guess I don't know. I guess I just really struggle with, how can you like ethically go about promoting, being green and doing green things and finding these alternatives.
Okay, so you're talking about sort of like what you might. I'm not familiar with the ribbon campaign, so that's interesting. I'll look that up. But the sort of greenwashing ourselves, right? So the thought is like I'm a good environmental citizen. I've got the bona fides to be. I'm the good hearty hippie, right? Who does the right things. I ride my bike. I have my solar panels and whatever else. That's kind of what you have in mind, right? So when it's the case that we're all participants in this kind of like post-industrial civilization and doing all the polluting.
I mean, it just seems kind of contradicting a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, in other literatures, this is sometimes called virtue signaling as opposed to greenwashing. I often refer to, I think about greenwashing very often in terms sort of corporate greenwashing. You find companies like Whole Foods that are, on one hand, great polluters. They contribute to the waste stream and contribute a lot of so-called ugly vegetables to the dumpsters for our dumpster diving friend over there. So you get some great foods in the Whole Foods dumpster. but they're doing some kind of greenwashing. But people will often engage in this kind of virtue signaling, or so goes the language, and that's a loaded term. So I apologize about introducing that. But I do think it makes sense to think of it kind of that way. And the thought there is that, like, I'm a better person than you are because I do the right kinds of things and I wear the right kind of clothes and I signal to you that I'm taking the right kinds of actions. When in fact, the carbon footprint between me and you, or me and somebody else who is, maybe more environmentally conscientious, is different for sure, right? But it's not clearly different than, say, somebody who lives in, say, India, right, where the carbon footprint is 10 to 20 times less than ours, largely due to poverty, or is not clearly having the same kind of effect on the market, right, due to market indeterminacies. I mean, the market's a very complicated system, right? And for us to think that, like, my refusal or abstention from the market to participate in, or my abstention from market activities is going to somehow influence the market in the way that's going to bring about the right kinds of outcomes, that's a mistake of economic reasoning. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something to that. I think also that and I'm going a little bit far afield here, but I think two things. First, that sometimes, and particularly in this political environment, these kinds of curated character expressions have the effect of polarizing our political discourse in a way that's not particularly constructive, and I think we experience that very dramatically now. And that's a problem for us. And I think, secondly, that so much emphasis on individual action in our discourse about how to be effective has the effect of undermining what can be effective collective action. And that's a huge problem for the environmental community. I really think we have to think a lot more collectively about how to address environmental problems. So I don't know if that directly responds to your concern, but
no,
yeah.
it did. I feel like
Yeah.
my question was a little bit scattered. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was just trying to make sense of it. But
Oh, my response
okay,
was
yeah.
super scattered.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to say your tea analogy.
Mike. Yeah. I'm looking out for you.
All right. The
His
tea.
job is much easier
Okay.
if he doesn't have to monkey with the audio. Go ahead.
Well,
Yes.
I was just thinking the tea analogy
Yeah.
kind of reminds me of, like, an oil company has a giant oil spill and they say, yes, but we're providing an antidote. We're going to put a surfactant all over it.
Yep.
And they're saying, we didn't, we harmed you, but we fixed it. But in reality, they're both pollutions. So,
Right.
I guess what would
Yeah.
scare me about you putting the poison and the antidote in there is that I don't believe you understand all the impacts.
Me or
Yeah,
BP?
you.
Oh, well, right. But suppose, as a philosopher, I have the privilege of both being snooty about things I know, but also I have the privilege of making up scenarios. Like, I can imagine a scenario where I have very good information. Maybe I'm a super duper scientist, right, and I have all the information I need, or I have some kind of, like, Laplacian demon that will tell me what's going on in the world. So we can imagine that there is such an antidote, right? That it's a relatively simple, yeah, that's right. Okay, yeah, but if you could just work. So now I'm going to ask you not to tweak the example too much, because tweaking the example in a way undermines its force, right? The thought is, in a world in which there were an antidote, and a perfectly known antidote, so it was just a simple molecular bond of some sort that would reverse the effects on a person, right? The health potion also doesn't exist, by the way. It can't just extend your life. But if we could just reverse the effects, right, of the pollutant, then it seems to me the wrong wouldn't be undone. That's all I want to say. That's all I want to lead you in that direction of. So I hear what you're saying, but I don't think science alone can get to the answer to that question. Yeah. Is that? Yeah. You want to call it done? Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for having me on.
Thanks.